what do you think?
Works for me.
All right, I got some thumbs up here. Bonjour, Marnie Indigenous, Gawin and Dodo Damascene, Bujweek Widong and Dunjaba, Onagamin and Da. May watch meet you. My name is Marnie Keski. I'm the Cultural Preservation Specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority, overseeing the Education and Outreach Division activities. Welcome to Gitganu Amagowin, Ijitwawin, Gaye Gitkain Dasowin, Maamawi, Ojibwe Teachings, Culture and Science Come Together. This is a partnership program between the St. Louis County Historical Society and the 1854 Treaty Authority. I'm here with my sidekick, Keisha Stoll. Hey, Keisha.
Hello.
She's the marketing coordinator with the St. Louis County Historical Society. Do you want to take a stab at explaining the history, people?
Absolutely. We were founded in 1922, coming up on a 100-year anniversary next year, so pretty excited about that. But our whole purpose is collecting, preserving, and presenting history. We are who we are today because of what we've been through in the past. So recording all that, keeping it, collect, preserve, and present. We're the history people at St. Louis County Historical Society.
Awesome, Miigwech. Thank you as I'm feeling out our technologies this evening. It's wonderful to have you guys out here. So the 1854, for those of you that don't know, are a little unfamiliar, the 1854 Treaty Authority is an intertribal natural resource management agency. We work for the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa as well as the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa. And we are tasked with two items to both protect as well as implement the off-reservation treaty rights harvest for the two bands. And those lands that were ceded to the United States government in the year of 1854, signed over through that treaty. Those lands are known today as northeastern Minnesota or the Arrowhead region. And Baboon and Zigwan are starting their annual brawl in the Twin Ports today. And how fitting is that we're here to discuss climate change. I wanted to take a poll and ask you guys to please raise your electronic hand if you took one look at the weather this week and started scrambling for your sugaring equipment, because that was me. So how we'll run today after this short introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Beeksma. Michelle is a Grand Portage enrollee. She is also the St. Louis County Historical Society president and the financial officer with 1854. Today she'll be speaking about seasonal aspects of Ojibwe culture. Likewise, we're honored to have Grand Portage Council Secretary April Mccormick with us. Bonjour, April. It's not that she doesn't have a full plate already, being on council, serving on council, and being a full-time mom. But when she contacted us in full support of this program series and with a willingness to participate, we were thrilled. So miigwech. Then we're going to hand it over to 1854's climate change staff, Tyler Kaspar and Hilarie Sorensen. We'll discuss the impacts of climate change on ceded lands and resources, the effects to subsistence harvest, and how they're monitoring these changes. So we're going to finish up today with a little Q&A. I was going to remind everybody to please respect our speakers and keep yourself muted during the session, but I actually have power and control over that, so my apologies. Please do us a favor and type your question into the chat, and I will do my best to moderate at the end. For those who entered a little bit late, Keisha did request that you change your name to your full name. We would agree to a first name basis normally, but she wants to make sure that she gets everybody's name in the prize drawing. Be sure to stick around for the whole hour as Keisha has some giveaway prizes that we're going to raffle off at the end. The thing is, you must be present.
Marnie, I just want to add one thing, because I know that some people are having a few technical difficulties. If you want to type your name in the chat box and, you know, with your iPhone is Courtney K. Something like that is totally fine, just so that I know who is who. Thanks.
Miigwech. If you enjoyed today's program, come on and join with us next week. We'll be talking all things wild rice, and expect a follow-up email tomorrow with a program evaluation and some additional learning resources. So miigwech, meet you. Michelle and April, you want to take it away?
Well, I think I'm going to get started just because my portion, I'm going to talk about the historical stuff, right? And then I think April's going to maybe take us into modern day and some of the things that her family does up on the reservation today. And that was really kind of a part of what the idea for this whole programming was to present some culture, history, and present, and then add in that sciencey aspect, right? So that's why we've got some very panelists today. So we'll go time order. I'm the history lady. I'm, like Marnie said, I'm the president down at the St. Louis County Historical Society, and a member of their American Indian Advisory Committee, which has actually existed since about 1994. And I think they're one of the first museum county history places in the area to have a board. I think the Minnesota State Historical Society has probably had one longer. They kind of modeled it after that, wanting to make sure that they were consulting and that there was a native voice being presented and listened to at the Historical Society, which I give them a lot of credit for. Joanne Coombe and actually my mom, Nora Hackla, were the ones that started American Indian Advisory Committee down there way back when. So I'm second generation down at the Historical Society, kind of picking up there. We have representatives from Bois Forte and Fond du Lac, and we're working on replacing our Grand Portage representative, Mary Ann, who was on last week, is retired. We have Vern Zacher from Fond du Lac and Jalen Strong from Bois Forte. And then we have an at-large representative, Mick Gillespie, who is a retired teacher from out at Fond du Lac Tribal Community College. So in talking about climate change, trying to find kind of the cultural tie-in, we decided to talk about, kind of that seasonal way of living. And so I thought I'd start out tonight talking about our Ojibwe Moons. Marnie is going to be my techie PowerPoint presenter because I'm alternate technology going here. So she's going to do a share screen and get us started with that. And the Ojibwe Moons are really kind of a good example. They're the way we told time, but all the names coincide with what was happening in nature, and really that idea of living with the earth and the changes in the seasons and how time was progressing. So we actually have 13 moons, right? Because it's a lunar cycle. Go to the next slide. And it's represented on a turtle's back, right? So you see you've got those 13 spots representing the different moons, and then along the edge is 28 for the lunar cycle. So I've got the names in Ojibwe there, and some of the months have different names. It's not really a hard and fast thing, and that'll vary by region and sometimes by band. And kind of one of the interesting things, Ojibwe country goes down into Wisconsin. We're actually kind of a little bit in the southern area of Ojibwe country because it goes up into Canada, right? So you've got those different varying times where the seasons change and where different things are happening. just because the further north you go, you get different growing seasons, things are changing at a different time. So the first month has the name Iskigamizige-giizis, which is the great spirit moon, great spirit being our creator, our word for the creator. It's also called Adaptation-giizis. It's the midwinter moon. So we say that's kind of the halfway through the winter. The second one, Anishinaabeg, or the sucker moon. It's kind of an interesting story there. And I think it's when we were, yep, okay. There's a story that when the Ojibwe, it's getting really cold and you get those super cold temperatures out there. A lot of times the fish go real deep, or they start kind of going to a real hibernating space. They go very, so it's harder to catch fish, right? Because we were out there fishing year round. But the sucker fish apparently come up a little higher. And our story is that they knew that the Anishinaabe were starving and needed to eat. So they came up to sacrifice themselves. Another name for it is Mccormick, the bald eagle moon. And there's kind of a tradition that's when you see those, because eagles actually do a little bit of migrating, or did. Even today, I guess they go down into kind of the upper Missouri area. You see tons of bald eagles down there. Some of them still hang around. We see them all winter, but they start to come back, or they start flying around. The Mccormick, the bear cub moon, it's when, the bear cubs are being born. And right now we're in the hard crust snow moon, right? So, and you kind of see that outside. The snow's got that hard crust on it because you get those warm and cold, and it kind of turns to ice. And it's when the crows come back. And then April, we have the boiling sap moon, right? That's when the maple trees start running. And but we were just talking about that a little bit off camera, that we start getting these warmer days and cold nights. The sap might start running already here in March, so maybe a little bit of a change going on there. And then we've got the leaves budding moon, or the flower moon. That's kind of in May. That's when things are starting to sprout. The strawberry moon, Hilarie, the midsummer moon, and then the Mccormick-giizis, the wild rice moon. That's kind of an interesting one too, depending on where you're at in Ojibwe country. Some people say that's August, some people say that's September, but that's kind of, it just ties into when their rice is starting to ripen. And the Ojibwe-giizis, when the leaves turn color and then they fall. The Ojibwe-giizis, where the water starts to freeze. And the Mccormick-giizis, the little spirit moon in December. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the boiling sap moon, since that's kind of coming up. And the word for that is Anishinaabeg. That's a maple tree, or a man tree. That a ninny there is actually what our word for man is. And it got that name. If you look at the leaf there, it's got 5 points that are kind of like fingers, and it looks kind of like it has veins. It has a sap that runs through it. That's, kind of like a blood system. Actually has some good, there's 46 bioactive compounds in maple sap water. So people are finding out that it's actually a very healthy thing, right? And we actually have some traditional stories that go along that, actually kind of follow along that a little bit. There's a story that when we were starving and there was very little game and very little to eat, that the Anishinaabeg talked to a man, an Anishinaabe, who was lying down, wondering what to do, and was very depressed about how to feed his family. And he heard this voice talking to him, and he couldn't figure out who was talking to him. And he finally realized that it was the tree. And the tree told him that he would help feed his family, that he should taught him how to tap the tree. Now the story is that when the sap first came out, it was already in that boiled down state, right? These days you have to take a whole bunch of sap and boil it down to get it to that concentrated state. But as time went on, the Anishinaabe, apparently we got a little fat and lazy. We weren't out there taking care of what we needed to do because we just had this, this flowing good liquid to keep us alive. So the story is that when Nanabaju came, he saw what was happening and said, "This isn't good for the people. They have to be reminded the value of hard work, that's where their self-esteem comes from, that they still need to go out and fish and to hunt and to be productive during the day." So he's actually the one, we say, that went and got buckets of water and poured it on top of the tree and watered down the sap. So next slide, we actually call it sugar bush. Bush is what we call the woods. Okay, it's kind of they'll talk about, when you hear natives talk, they'll say that they're going out to the bush. All right, which is kind of our lingo, I guess. So we're going to start with a little bit of history here. This is a picture from the Minnesota Historical Society collection of a couple of ladies making traditional maple sap collecting muckucks or containers. So that big white tower there, those are actually the smaller ones that would be placed under the trees. And then those would be picked up and gathered and then dumped into that bigger one that's sitting next to her. Now that bigger one, because of the way it's constructed, needs to be pitched so that it can hold liquid. The picture didn't say, there's a couple of different things you can use for pitching. Usually you see it as a black pitch, but generally you use spruce gum for that. So that's one of them. Now, those little containers, if you want to flip the slide there, got a close up. Those are actually folded. Now that's one that's from Grand Portage. It's in the MHS collection. It was collected by Frances Desmore, if you should know that name. She actually did a lot of collecting of artifacts and songs and stories. And so it's folded so that it'll hold the liquid. And when they're constructed, you've got that white outer part of the bark. It's actually the inner bark where the waterproof part comes in. So when it's constructed, it's kind of inside out from what you think it would have been constructed. Now this one may be the other direction. Now I do have, Marty, can you put me back on screen for a minute? So I do have an actual one here in my office. All right, so this was actually found a little bit north of here. You can see the construction where it's been folded and tied. We kind of poke a hole through all those layers and put the tie in there. This one's, it's dirty on the inside, so it was actually used. All right. And if you can tell from where, in relation to my head, it's about my shoulder width, I guess, maybe a little bit shorter. This is actually in really good condition. You can see that this is the white inner bark on the inside, sort of. And then this would, or the outer bark, the white part on the inside, and the inner bark here on the outside. So a lot of containers are constructed that way because a lot of times they would store the containers in the ground, whether it had berries or wild rice or whatever. So you kind of want this waterproof part in contact with the ground so that it won't absorb the moisture from the soil. Okay, so it should keep everything on the inside dry. I am wearing, did someone say were you wearing gloves? Yeah, this is actually a historic artifact and I'm trying not to get my hand oils on it. It's in my office. It's been put in my care by a Fond du Lac woman. It's and awaiting a home. She hasn't quite decided where it's going yet, but she trusted me to hang on to it. So I'm doing my very best to be responsible with it. Along with it, there's some scrapers. Okay, so this is something you'd use in your hand. And this is, we'll go to, in the next couple of slides, you'll see when it'd be used in making maple sugar, not the syrup. Okay. So, yep. So that's a picture of the boil down process. And, you know, it isn't just one kettle at a time. They'd have these big racks set up so that they could have multiple kettles hanging at a time. This is actually a modern picture, not a historic one. People are still using the metal kettles and setting up those big racks. It almost looks like a big arbor that you would hang them from to hold the weight. And you can go to the next slide. This is a picture that was taken up at the Grand Portage Natural Monument. I took the picture. So we don't have to worry about copyright issues. Yeah. But that, whoop, go back one. So the rectangular object that's kind of in the background there, kind of angled, that's actually a sugar trough. You would put the sap in there and let it dry and cool. And then you would use that scraper that I showed you to kind of move it around and keep shifting it and get it into a crystallized state where it looks like brown sugar, right? And you see they have a folded small sap collecting bucket along with the kettles and some of the hooks there to hang everything. Okay, you can go to the next one. So wanted to give you a heads up on some of the publications, educational resources, or if you're just interested in, or like this one is probably geared a little more towards the kids. It's a coloring book. It's in PDF format. It is printable. You can download it off the 1854 Treaty Authority's website. You click on management, education and outreach, then publications, and you should find it. There's also some other publications there as well. One, the treaty rights, a moose brochure, wild rice. There's a climate change adaptation plan brochure there. Next one. On the St. Louis County Historical Society website, which is www.thehistorypeople.org, we have some Ojibwe learning guides. And one of them is the seasonal rounds that talks about that seasonal way of living. It goes through all the seasons and different activities that would be done during those seasons. We kind of gearing them towards middle school kids as far as reading and content level. But if you're, if you're new to Ojibwe culture and you're just learning to learn something, hopefully, even as an adult, you might pick up something. We also have ones on crafting, powwows, Ojibwe language, and treaties out there as well. So you go to their website, click on educational resources, and then you'll see a little thing that says Ojibwe Gallery Guides. And we're hoping to keep adding to those as time goes on. So hopefully that'll be a good resource for teachers and parents and other people. Yeah, next one. And back on the 1854 Treaty Authority website, we have a couple of documents related to climate change that Hilarie and Tyler are going to talk to. One is our adaptation and management plan that we worked on. They're kind of big, long documents, but if you're really techie and you want to see what's happening, there's actually another tribal climate adaptation plan there as well. So there's 2 documents out there. They're both in PDF format. You can click on them, print them off, just read them, whatever. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to April.
Oh, hey.
My apologies.
Hey, that's okay. Well, just chimigwech to Marnie for offering me some asema to come and share a little bit of my personal story or observations I've seen in different changes in the seasons, or those that have kind of taught me about subsistence hunting or harvesting, some of those things that I've been taught or have been shared with me. And so I just want to kind of start because, if we were all in person, we might share, well, I'm from Grand Portage, where are you from? Tell me your name. And we might say, oh, I know so-and-so from Leech Lake or so-and-so from St. Paul, Minneapolis that shares your name. Are you related? And so I feel like there's a little bit of getting to know one another that happens naturally when we gather. And so in the interest of time, we obviously won't be able to do that, but I just wanted to say that, my name is April Clearwater Day. Married name is McCormick, and I'm a Grand Portage band member. I've lived here all my life, went away to college and came back to the community. My husband and I have 4 children under the age of 9, and we're surviving this pandemic life of working and balancing schedules and them attending school and also doing hybrid Zoom school. So, it's been quite the adaptation, and we're looking forward to maybe doing some sugar bushing this week since the temperature swings are kind of good for that this week. And so my personal connection to the issue that we have as it's been presented is really talking about things that are important to Grand Portage or to the 1854 ceded territory in our co-management of resources, because I really would love to see the ability of our children and our grandchildren to be able to live off the land in the ways that they choose to, if it's picking berries on the side of a trail, or it's hunting moose, catching a brook trout in a stream. These are the things that are really important when I think about the initiatives that we have today and talking about this topic. And so you won't find that I'll be sharing any sort of scientific PhD study with you today. So let me just throw that disclaimer out there that you'll be just hearing kind of personal story. And so I was thinking about this issue, and I wanted to share with you that I had reached out to gather some information, and some of the information that came back from global and national kind of scale impacts of climate change talks about inequities that affect tribes, tribal members, and their ability to harvest resources or find sustainable food sources. And often the language impact was written in such a way where it was that we're victims or that they're threats to our ways of life. And I just want to kind of flip that narrative as we talk, because that's, even if that's the way it's projected in research or out there in the mainstream, I really would like to just have you focus on the fact that tribes and tribal members are resilient and that we survive and we adapt. And we've been doing it for generations. And so that's really what speaks to my heart tonight is just sharing that with you, because we've been adapting all along. And so, you know, as the climate is getting warmer or things are changing for the different species that we live off of, and provide sustenance to our families, that we're going to continue to adapt, and we're going to try to implement ways to protect those resources. And so, as Michelle shared earlier, we live by the seasons, right? And we're coming into the sugar bush season. And so I think about like the temperature fluctuations that are just right. And our little family has been harvesting maple sap for about 4 years. We did take 1 year off. And so the first year we were actually super early out there sapping in early February. So I remember it being a very early year to be out in the woods, and it had those high temperatures during the day and then those cold snaps at night. So there was a really large production of sap to boil eventually at the end of the season or throughout the season. And so I remember some of our friends that kind of mentored us into it were like, you know, we're kind of out there a little early, and we're like, we're learning, we're picking up as much as we can. And so, for that year to be our first year, it was kind of funny because it actually worked out in our favor. And I still remember our littlest, holding her hand up to catch the sap in her hand and licking the sap out of her hand. And those are some of like the most beautiful moments that I'll have to share with our family about the importance of knowing that this comes from a tree, and that we can boil it down and it makes a really healthy sugar that we can use in our foods or in our coffee, and we don't have to worry about kind of the high processed sugars that exist in other types of sugar. And I was thinking about these colder temps that exist kind of growing up. We had a lot of snow. In 1992, I remember there was this huge snowstorm in Cook County, and the snow piled up to like the door frame or the where the roof comes off the house. There was snow all the way up there. And so we had a lot of snow growing up. And as a teenager, I remember noticing that our winters were becoming less and less snow and more brown. So you'd see like the grass, and you'd see the waboos, the rabbit, running by, and his whole body would be white and he would stick out like a sore thumb. And so you knew that it was going to be a little bit harder year on the rabbits. And I was talking to my stepdad the other day, and he said, it never used to rain so much in late November and December. We have a lot of ice now, where it's just heavy rain and it makes ice in the parking lots and things. And he's like, that just really didn't happen as much. And thinking about ice formations and in the wintertime, on the big lake, where Grand Portage is nestled between Lake Superior and what we now know to be Canada. And so families used to travel back and forth freely before the establishment of the state, before the establishment of the United States and the US-Canadian border. And so families between, Fort William First Nation, up there on the Canadian side, and Grand Portage were interconnected. A lot of babies were born up in Thunder Bay. And so, the interconnectedness of families amongst the bands on this side of the border and Canada were very strong. And so with the ice formations, people could actually go out onto the lake in the bay of Grand Portage, and they could go back and forth between the island, Grand Portage Bay Island. And one story that was shared with me that I thought was really interesting as a young person was because we see that there's hardly any ice forming where it stays for a long period of time, or where it would form all the way out to the island. And so my stepdad was saying that families could literally skate to the island, and if there was a brave person who wanted to drive their car out on the bay, that you might occasionally see that happen. And so we don't really see that happening any longer. And he shared this story about the interconnection of families. So he shared about how his mother, when they were getting to know his mother and father were getting to know each other, the father from Grand Portage would put his skates on and he would skate around the point and cross Washwanigan Bay and then over to Pigeon Point and then cross again. And then he would skate up to a place, a bay that was called Squaw Bay. And so it was a roughly 35 miles or so to skate to see Emma. And so I thought that was a really beautiful story about how families traveled and how I would never put a pair of skates on and try to skate across Washwanigan Bay. But I think that's a really neat story that could be shared, and something we could learn from. And maybe someday we'll see a cold winter where, the ice might form in such a way where that could be possible. But for me, I'm staying on the mainland. I think about the water levels in the lake in Grand Portage. We had some really severe storms last fall, and a year ago, 2019, some really heavy storms that eroded some of our one of our local roads along the bay that has housing right along the bay there. And so that was a really impactful thing just for our community to realize that, for road maintenance and for the tribe to be able to ensure that the road is sustained, that we had to reach out to the state and the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs for roads resources in order to repair some of that heavy erosion that occurred due to substantial wind and wave action. And so likely, with the changes in water levels, or what's known as 100-year flood events, heavy rains, like we saw in the Duluth area, those types of storms really impact us all the way up the shore. And so to be prepared for that kind of reinvestment in our road systems, and also understanding what kind of an impact that might have on our animals that we depend on. So speaking of animals, some of the animals that we've seen this far north have been very odd and out of place. We've seen raccoons as north as Grand Portage, and that's really been a really recent adaptation to warmer climates, or their migration. And so we often joke about turkeys being as far north as Lutzen, and possums have been sighted, and so that's very unusual. And so I think there are effects of climates that are having impacts on animals being able to make it a sustainable life up more up north, I guess, for lack of a better term. And a couple of things that are really important to Grand Portage are, for particularly the brook trout, we have a loss of what's called a thermal habitat. And It means that basically our waters are becoming more warm, so the brook trout aren't able to like survive the temperature fluctuations. We had a really interesting project in on Reservation River where we actually restored a section of the river to promote brook trout habitat, and had rock riffle pools and spruce root tree wad balls in there, and it created a lot of different habitat and had a lot of natural impacts to that landscape that protected the bank from eroding in the change of the river levels rising, or spring thaw when the snow is thawing and the waters are higher. So that's just another little interesting fact about brook trout. Particularly, what's been interesting for me as a moose hunter is, you know, effects on the moose population, particularly moose being more susceptible to parasites that can be spread by the deer, and winter ticks being able to survive warmer winters, so that when the ticks collect on the moose, they usually, if it's colder, they can drop off and kind of die off. But what we're finding is that more moose have more ticks that are lasting longer, and so it just really creates a lot of issues for the moose in their health and different things regarding that. We've seen predation on calves from bear and wolves, and so that's had a huge impact on the ability of the moose population to sustain itself in the landscape. Sometimes when you're out hunting in the fall, the weather is warmer, and so, you know, moose don't like to move around when it's too hot. They like to try to find a cool place, like a swamp or a shadowy place under a spruce tree to kind of bed down and stop moving around and expending all the energy. And I heard that their throats actually can swell, so it makes it hard for them to be able to kind of control their temperature, and that action of that warm air and temperature making them have that effect on their throats. And so, you know, we kind of see these like secondary effects that are happening, and we obviously want to study them and make sure that we can control what we can control as humans and our effect there. We also have a lot of changes from industry, like increasing levels of sulfate in watersheds or mercury in the air from industry causes a lot of what's called air deposition, and that's where the mercury builds up in the air, and it might be produced from, you know, somewhere across the world or somewhere in the nation, and that mercury precipitates in the rain, and it actually impacts a lot of waterways. So, you know, there's a lot of regulatory work that we do together with the state and with the feds to ensure that our issues, well, I shouldn't say issues, our concerns are being mitigated as we work together with these agencies. So, for example, one of the things I wanted to just leave you with is, you know, tribes have a distinct relationship with the federal government. We have what's called usufructuary rights or property rights, the ability to use the land or thrive off the land in relation to those treaties in a way that's different than how might be understood commonly or in the mainstream today. And so one of the things that I wanted to just share with you is that it's really important that as we think about tribes thriving is the work that we do as tribal governments together with these agencies to actually manage our resources in a way that protects them for future generations. So those rights should be guaranteed into perpetuity, meaning that the water has to be clean enough to drink. The fish have to be clean enough to harvest and to eat, safe to consume. You know, our wild rice waters need to be protected so that they can always reseed themselves and be able to provide that beautiful food source that's a spiritual food for families and our people. And so there's a lot of ways in which that intersects with that modern day governance, and that it intersects with culture and what's spiritually relevant to us as people. And so one last thing, you know, these earrings that I'm wearing, a dear friend of mine gave them to me, and she made them. Her name is Beth Drost, and she talked about her grandmother Emma and her aunt Mabel and how these beads were from them, and she had them in a little container, and she said, I'm going to give you these earrings, I made them for you, and this is a reminder of all these women who are meaningful to me, and I want to pass this on to you. And so I think about these teachings, and I think about the rights that we promote or that we become engaged in as adults, and whether it's formally as a tribal government or it's individually a passion that you care about. You know, some of these teachings are passed down, and some of these are learned through self-discovery. And so we carry these with us. And so, like these earrings I'm wearing tonight, you know, we carry these teachings with us, and it's something that's living and breathing. And so I hope that you've come away with something that we've shared tonight that is meaningful and propels you to really try to learn more and engage more in issues that are important to tribes and tribal members. So Miigwech for the honor to speak with you tonight.
That was beautiful, April. Miigwech.
Thank you, Marnie. Of course, there's a plane going over right now, so I apologize if it's loud. I'm going to share my screen really quick. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Or Marnie? Okay, good. All right, so bonjour everyone. My name is Hilarie Sorensen, and I'm the climate specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority. And Tyler, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes.
Cool. Oops, sorry about that. Tyler, if you want to introduce yourself quick.
I thought there might be more to that. Yeah, my name is Tyler Kaspar. I'm an environmental biologist at the 1854 Treaty Authority. I'm also involved with the climate change program.
All right, wonderful. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you so much, Michelle and April, for sharing your perspectives on climate change, both from a historical perspective and also from the observations of what's happening on the landscape. April, you just covered all the things, so we appreciate it. Thank you. Today, Tyler and I just want to talk a little bit more about what we've been seeing in the 1854 ceded territory with climate change. And then Tyler's going to talk a little bit about the development of the vulnerability assessment and climate adaptation plan. And then we'll just share a couple of examples of some of the projects that we're working on to address and monitor some of the changes that are happening in this area. So as Marnie mentioned, we are governed by we're an intertribal natural resource management organization. We're governed by Bois Forte and Grand Portage, and we cover this area on the map on the left here, which is over 5 million acres. And as Marnie mentioned, our primary goal is really to preserve and protect these treaty rights. And April mentioned these rights as well. and protect the beings that are culturally and ecologically important to the bands. And one of the particular challenges with climate change that is unique to ceded territories and tribal communities is that these are fixed geographic boundaries. So as climate changes increase stress on beings such as moose or paper birch or cold water fish species, which are already kind of at the southern end of their geographic range, these beings may move out of this area and no longer be accessible to band members for treaty harvest. And so that's one of the unique challenges that we are looking to explore more and to address. And so this led to a project that was a collaboration between the 1854 Treaty Authority, Bois Forte, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, to develop a vulnerability assessment and climate adaptation plan to particularly focus on the beings and treaty resources within the 1854 ceded territory. And this was started in 2015 and completed in 2016. Some of the beings that have already been mentioned, we've talked a lot about Anishinaabeg, sugar maple, paper birch, monoman, moose, and oga or walleye. All of these beings are of particular importance to this area and to the communities that live here. And so these are some of the beings that we put particular focus on through this plan, this vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. So there was a three-part process to developing this. First, we had to look at what climate changes we are already starting to see on the landscape, and then take that information combined with human activities like CO2 emissions to try and project out and predict how these changes are going to continue over the next several generations. And then taking that information, this would help us to determine what beings are going to be most vulnerable to these changes, which ones are already experiencing stress of different kinds that climate change can sort of act as a threat multiplier. So beings that may already be experiencing stress or experiencing problems, and how is climate change going to exacerbate that? And then what can we do on the landscape to maintain these beings, to protect them, and keep them on the landscape as much as we can. So in the Great Lakes region, we've already started to see many changes from climate change. These graphs here are looking at the period from 1951 through 2017. It doesn't go through the present day, but the changes that are listed here have continued to what we're seeing currently. We have seen an increase in just average temperature. We're seeing more of those hot days. We've already seen changes by about 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit. We're seeing a longer frost-free season, or a longer growing season, by almost 2 weeks. So this is going to have big ramifications for some of the things that April mentioned: ice on lakes, spawning of cold water fish species like walleye. It's going to impact the phenology of beings like snowshoe hare and the timing of when they change their coat color. All sorts of things are going to be impacted by even this 2-week shift in the frost-free season. We are seeing a general uptick in precipitation, but the big takeaway with this is that precipitation is coming in the form of heavy storm events more and more. So in recent years, particularly in the late summer, early fall, we're seeing these big wind and rain events that are having big impacts for not only ecosystems, but infrastructure and flooding and things like that, particularly along the lakeshore of Lake Superior. So those are the changes we've already seen up to this point. Looking forward, looking over the next couple of generations, scientists have created these statistical downscaled climate models. And these particular one is a compilation of models that are looking out to the year 2070. So we're expecting to see a lot of what we've already been observing, with particular focus, I'll point out, to these changes in winter. We're already experiencing warmer winters. We're getting snow, but then we'll also get a warm-up period. We'll get rain during the winter months. And this is really impacting the way that the seasons are transitioning, as well as the beings that depend on these seasonal shifts. So again, I'll bring up the example of the snowshoe hare and changing its coat color and sticking out like a sore thumb when it's still white, but we have no snow on the ground. So winter is really where we're putting a lot of focus on a lot of our climate change activities, because that is really where we're going to continue to see the most change, as well as, again, that those transition periods, those changes to the timing of when seasonal activities are happening. So at this point, I'll hand things over to Tyler to talk a little bit about the vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan.
Hey, thanks, Hillary. So are you just going to change the slides as we go?
Yep, I'll do the slides.
All right, thanks a lot. So really the second phase of the vulnerability, the climate adaptation plan, which was really definitely took the longest, was the vulnerability assessment. So trying to determine a process for really trying to figure out how beings have been and will be affected by climate change, positive or negative. So we started with a workshop to go to actually develop a process for determining vulnerability. And that's where, for this project, we actually worked with Adaptation International and also Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, so GLISA. And they really brought in the latest climate science. We actually contracted them to help with developing the plan. And they also brought in a process for developing the plan. So this workshop was, again, focused on the process and also kind of starting with resource categories, as you can see here on the slide, like kind of broadly, like air quality, aquatic terrestrial plants, culturally significant places, water quality and quantity, and so on. And really, after we had a process and kind of these broader categories, the next step was developing kind of like these smaller groups and teams that are more to more focus in on these categories, identify the beings that we would include in each of those categories in the assessment. Next slide. And this is a result of the vulnerability assessment here. And I'll just briefly explain the what you're seeing here. If you look at, there's on the upper part of the table, you see sensitivity. And on the left-hand side, you see adaptive capacity. Those are the two things that we really focus in on for each of the beings to try to understand how they may be affected by climate change. Sensitivity being how sensitive are they to the changes in current climate and how will they be affected in future climate. And the adaptive capacity is how well they can be able to adapt to those changes. What do they have? Is there anything we can provide for that? And you can see this gradient with low sensitivity and high adaptive capacity up in the green, where you see like black crappie, white-tailed deer. Those are things that we, and the information we used was our expertise from our own tribal staff from 1854, Boys Fort, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac, also scientific literature. But what you're seeing the results of is actually more of a qualitative analysis, kind of gauging based on what we know, what do we think where are they going to be at. So again, the upper left, you see things that are going to probably do well with climate, and there's probably not a big surprise there. And you see a gradient going all the way down to the lower right-hand corner where things are more highly sensitive and really aren't able to adapt very well. And these are beings that have already been mentioned, and the impacts have already been mentioned as well, for like moose, brook trout, like paper birch and boreal wetlands. And so that was the vulnerability assessment piece, and then it's like, well, now what do we do about this? What are some actions that we can take to help help some of these beings with the shifts in climate? The ones you see bolded in here on the table are actually were part of another workshop. And that was actually develop these adaptation strategies. We were able to develop detailed strategies for the ones in bold here, but we actually did develop strategies for all the beings that you see on here. So we can go to the next slide and I can talk about that a little bit. And you see that we actually developed over 270, about 270 strategies total in the plan. But what you see here are some examples of some of those beings that were in bold font that we had the workshop. And these strategies really fell into kind of different categories, we felt. So we see like collaborative strategies, conservation, preservation, and maintenance, education, monitoring, assessment, and also restoration strategies. Okay, next slide. So after the plan was completed in 2016, that really started our climate program. So we hired on climate specialist to take the reins and implement the program. And I'm also helping implement the program, and it's based on this plan. I will start off by talking about some of our monitoring work. We'll go to the next slide. For monitoring lake temperatures, we put these, as you can see on the slide, temperature loggers. So really they're continuous data loggers. We put them on hourly intervals, and we put them in 20 lakes that we assess for walleyes. And we do that also in a partnership with the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, and also share information with the State Department of Natural Resources. So in 20 of the lakes that we do assessments on, we place one logger in each in about 5 feet of water. And from 2015 to 2019, they're placed in about, they're placed in May, then we pull them out in October. What was new in 2020 is we actually started doing year-round deployment. We changed methods a little bit, and they're actually out there right now. So we'll download the data coming up in the spring. Next slide. And you can see here just an example for one of the lakes, what we have so far for, this is Wild Rice Reservoir, and this is near our office in Duluth. You're just looking at, for each month, you're looking at by year what the annual or the average temperature that recorded was for each of those months. And again, we have more data coming for 2020, but this is kind of an example of what we have so far. And this is also in a report that's on our website. We have it summarized for each of the 20 lakes. Okay, next slide. Another project we're doing with temperature, but also we actually added dissolved oxygen monitoring on head of Lakes Bay and Lake Vermilion. Now, Lake Vermilion is a very important place, resource for the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa. Long history of, they have the current reservation there, but before that, there's a long history of harvesting walleye in a big, a sense of place. And so what we did is we worked with kind of coordinate with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources to find a location that would make sense to deploy this logger chain that you see a diagram of here that has basically it's a vertical line with loggers that are attached, evenly spaced about 1 meter apart. And at 3 meters, 6 meters, and 9 meters, there are loggers that you see here on the slide. The dissolved oxygen logger, it also records temperature. And we also, talking with the DNR, kind of tried to determine where we place those because they're expensive. They're $1,200, so we couldn't buy a whole lot of them. But that we try to place it in the upper, the 3 layers of the water column when it does stratify, and it does in this location, the epilimnium, metalimnium, and hypolimnium. So in the graph that you see, is this an example of the dissolved oxygen logger that was placed at 3 meters, and this was from 2018. And you can see the data logged throughout just like the season through October anyways. And you can see the temperature in orange, and you can see the dissolved oxygen in blue. And that's just a pattern you may expect, but it's just kind of neat to actually see that. Once you get to that turnover event, you see the temperature decline in this upper part of the water column, and you see that increase in oxygen, dissolved oxygen as well. So we have data, well, supposedly through 2020, but right now some of that data is actually stuck on a computer locked by BitLocker. Not a huge fan. If anyone's got some tips for that, please let us know. Next slide. Last, certainly but not least, like Hilarie mentioned before, we're really, there's a lot of focus on winter monitoring, and especially through what April has mentioned with a lot of the changes in like Grand Portage. They've seen a lot of big changes with winter and snow and ice. So what we're doing is we're monitoring, there's 10 lakes in the ceded territory that we monitor ice thickness, but also we're also tracking snow cover in a minute. Lakes were selected by available ice records. So this climatology office have and the Department of Natural Resources a record of observations for ice out. And then so lakes that had good records of ice out, we selected. Also whether or not they're walleye and or wild rice lakes. You can see there's also a distribution here because Pike Lake and Moosehead aren't necessarily lakes that are the walleye or wild rice lakes we would do any management work on. But you look in there in the southern end of the ceded territory, so we thought that'd be important to monitor. What we do for ice checks is once a month we go to each lake in the same location. We drill a hole. You can see the picture in the lower right hand corner here. Pretty cool shot at Wilson Lake. We measure total ice thickness, then the measurement of clear ice, which in the case for Wilson here, the whole thing was clear ice. But when there's that frozen gray slush layer, we're also tracking that as well. Snow depth on the ice we measure, and also snow depth on shore and the weather conditions. And now I'll turn it over to Hilarie, and she will talk about the snow monitoring.
Thanks, Tyler. I'm noticing that in every single picture, field picture of me, I look like I'm freezing. So that's great. So as Tyler mentioned, we are monitoring ice at these 10 lakes. We're also monitoring snow. So I mentioned that we're still getting a lot of snow in the winter months, but we are getting warmer winters, and some of that snow is coming in the form of rain. And we're seeing less snowpack, less snow cover over the winter season. And this is going to have big impacts for how beings are able to move on the landscape, access food, access shelter. And so this year, we've started to monitor snow more in a more targeted way. So at these same locations where we do the ice lakes, we also have a 200-meter snow depth transect where we're taking a measurement of depth every 50 meters to get a sense of snow cover across the ceded territory as well. I'll also mention that this picture on the lower right of the ice check hole at Wilson, this was this year in December before we got all the snow, but we had that really rapid freeze up. So there people were out ice skating on all the lakes around the Duluth area and up in Cook County. So it was just a really interesting year for how that formed this year. Sorry, I'm multitasking here. So that's a lot of our monitoring program. Oops. I also mentioned when we were talking about climate change impacts that a lot of these impacts are going to impact the seasonal timing of when things happen. So when these seasonal shifts are happening. So a lot of the other aspects that we look at is concerning phenology, or the timing of seasonal events. So at 2 of our wild rice waters, we have time-lapse cameras up that stay out from the spring until usually December, and they're taking a picture once an hour of the lake. And so that gives us information about when the ice forms on the lake in the fall and when the ice leaves the lake in the spring, as well as other factors like waterfowl presence or if there's a big storm in that area. We're also looking at wetlands, specifically looking at amphibian and waterfowl populations at wetlands, because that's a great indicator for how healthy that wetland is. So we have acoustic recorders that track frogs, toads, and waterfowl at these same 2 wild rice waters where we have the cameras. And then finally, we are collecting information about the sugar maple sap run and how the seasonal shifts may be affecting the timing of when the sap starts running. This is a great year. This is a great example year of how that can shift. And there were some fantastic stories and examples that were shared earlier by Michelle and April on this as well. And I'll put in a brief plug for all of you harvesters out there. If you are interested in sharing information from tapping the trees this year, please contact me or Marnie or Tyler. Our contact information will be on the last slide tonight. But we are interested in collecting information about when the sap run is starting, how is the sap flowing, and the weather conditions while you're out there as well. And then added to those acoustic recorders that we have to look at wetlands, we are also doing visual ground surveys in partnership with Grand Portage. They have a Circle of Flight project that is conducting wetland surveys at 3 wetlands in Cook County, 3 in Lake County, and 3 in St. Louis County. And so we're helping with the more southern locations where we do visual and auditory assessments of frogs and toads, as well as waterfowl to see what sorts of critters are hanging out at different times of year. Next up, we have just a few projects that are going to expand on some of the things we're already doing. One of them is to work with partner organizations to track algae, particularly algae that forms near boat landings at many of our inland lakes. This picture on the upper left is taken at Head of the Lakes Bay in Lake Vermilion. This was from September of 2019. And so just, we don't know much about algae and if any of it can be harmful. So we're working with organizations like the University of Minnesota Natural Resources Research Institute and the EPA lab here to take some pictures, take some water samples, and get a better sense of what's happening at some of these lakes. We're also working with the Superior National Forest to look at changing forest conditions under climate change, which species are under particular stress from changing climate, and which species may be moving up into this area from more southern locations. And so looking at what they call assisted migration or strategies for preserving important species on the landscape, and also potentially getting hold of seeds for species that are already up in this area from more southern locations to help facilitate their movement into this area as well. And then finally, I mentioned snow. We have started to measure more snow depth at those areas where we measure ice as well, but we're interested in other properties other than snow depth itself, but like density of snow or water content. So what type of snow are we having, and how does that tie into habitat for the beings that are living and moving on the landscape? So with that, I'll say miigwech for being here tonight, for all of the panelists who have shared their perspectives and stories and information. Our contact information is listed here, as well as a couple of resources, including that climate adaptation plan and a couple of other reports. And then once again, if you're interested in sharing some information about the sugar maple sap run, please contact one of us and we will send you some additional information. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing and see if I can hand things over to Marnie, possibly.
Hey, wonderful. Chimigwich. Awesome. Before everybody runs away, I want to hand it right over to Keisha for our drawing, and then we'll get squared away with a little Q&A. Unfortunately, Michelle had to run. She had another event to make it to this evening, but let me share with Keisha, and she'll get the drawing underway.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes. You want me to, here, I'll
You know what, that's okay, because I'm going to share my screen and they would rather look at the wheel of names than my mug, so it's quite all right. Nope, I can't share my screen, so
I know. I'm gonna make you host. Hang on a second.
All right. So while Marnie,
There you go.
all right, awesome. We do have some prizes to give away. Prizes that were donated from 1854. Huh. Apparently I'm not doing full screen this time, so that's okay. So donated from 1854 and from the St. Louis County Historical Society. So we have 7 prizes.
Guys, congratulations to our winners. Just wanted to open it up a little bit and ask if anybody has any questions. I did write down a few from earlier on in the session. One question from Rachel Portinga at Lakehead University. Michelle mentioned the 46 compounds in the maple sap, and we didn't quite know if that is something that sticks around after the boil or not. And we threw it back to Michelle. She honestly didn't know a whole lot more than that. She did a quick Google search, and it looks like it depends on the temperature in which you boil at. To give you one example. Thank you all for coming. I know some of you have to buzz out and hit another meeting, so miigwech, please stick around if we can answer your questions and get them funneled to the right people. We have some questions right here about where you can access the 1854 Ceded Territory vulnerability assessment and climate adaptation plan that can be found on the 1854 website under the climate page.
I'll also just mention that we do a yearly climate summary report. The 2020 report should be up on our website this week.
All right, another one from Rachel. Hilarie and Tyler, where do the graphics come from showing the 4 seasons and increased temp and precip, those charts?
Yes, I should have put that on there. Those are from Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments. Those were the contractors that we worked with to put together the vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. And so if you just go to Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or GLISA, they'll have all of those graphs publicly available, and they do update them pretty regularly.
Miigwech for being here, Muriel. It's good to see you, or see your name at least. We have a question here from Travis, disguised as Sarah. He's curious about the snow depth measurements on the lakes being monitored. Where are the measurements taken on the lake or in the woods near the lake?
So that's a good question. They are taken in the woods near the lake. We try to find, we just use the lakes because we're already going up there for the ice checks, but we do try to get a pretty broad geographic distribution. So we go a ways away from the lake and see if we can find a path that is at least 200 meters long that we can pop up and take those regular snow measurements every 50 meters.
And Travis, we're still hoping to see you join our Instagram scavenger hunt challenge at some point. Anybody else? Anybody else? I want to say Chimigwech to all of the MTAG and MTree students that joined us this evening from UMD. Also for our members on Res up in Nett Lake, Vermilion, and Grand Portage. Also our Duluth folks. I see Brett. Hey, Brett, hoping that you'll take part in our maple sugaring data exchange here, as well as, hey, Eric made it on. Jess Koski. Any other questions, you guys? Oh, Seamus Kavanaugh. Spring peepers are often used as a sign that the maple season is ending. Any plans on looking at that relationship between spring peeper phenology and maple sugaring?
Yes, thank you, Seamus. That's a good question. I hope so, because the acoustic monitoring and those wetland surveys have just wrapped up their first year. We're still kind of in data analysis mode, but I think once we get more long-term data, it would be fantastic to make that comparison. And I'd be interested in seeing if other organizations have already started to look at that.
He says, right on. Can you guys show us with your electronic hands how many of you are with other environmental educators or organizations that do interpretation? 1, 2, 3. Miigwech. Seamus, who are you with? UW, is it? Yep. Yeah, you presented when Tansy was here, right? Yeah, yeah. We actually have a video of you on our YouTube channel. It was a great presentation. Hilarie just shared her email information in the chat if anybody is interested. You can also find the emails for any of our staff at 1854 on our website. Is that the same with St. Louis County Historical Society too, Keisha?
Yes. Yes, on our contact. Let me pause that. We are updating our contact page, so I'm not entirely sure it's up right now, but it's just going to be our first name. If you have our first name, that's great, and then it's at the history people.
Yeah, use yours as an example on the chat.
Absolutely. Make sure I'm sending this to everyone. Yeah, and if you don't know everybody else's first name, you now have my email address, and I can make sure it gets to where it needs to go.
Travis has threw us another brain buster here. Just curious if you guys share or compare data with state climatologists too. Hilarie's on the ball. Yes, we do, Travis.
And I'll just add to that there may be a project coming up working with the state climatology folks to get some more downscaled climate information specifically for the 1854 ceded territory. So if that funding comes through, that would be very helpful.
Any other questions? If people are putting kiddos to bed and whatnot right now. Don't see any more questions coming in, so I want to say Jimmy-gutch again one more time to April Clearwater Day for making herself available. She's a very busy woman, but sharing that stuff was very meaningful. We really appreciate that. Oh, I see one hand up here. I'll try to figure out who that is. That was
And I'd like
Travis.
to echo the thanks to, on behalf of the St. Louis County Historical Society. Thanks very much to 1854 and everyone for the wonderful information, and to everyone for joining us. It was really good to see so many people here tonight.
Thank you too for Tyler and Hilarie sharing what they know and what they do. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to email us and check your inbox tomorrow, as we will be forwarding you some resources. All right, Gigawabamin Minoa.